A desperate architect assumed he was simply rescuing a decaying piece of Pennsylvania history when he purchased an abandoned church for $1. However, that incredibly cheap real estate transaction didn't just save a building. Instead, his renovations unearthed a deadly 200-year-old secret with the power to rewrite history itself. Asher Caldwell was a man who had lost everything but his eye for structure. At 42, the Chicago-based architect was reeling from a brutal divorce and the subsequent collapse of his boutique firm. Bankrupt and emotionally hollowed out, Asher was mindlessly scrolling through a municipal tax lien website when a peculiar listing caught his eye. It was a property in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, specifically in a forgotten patch of rural land near the Susquehanna River. The listing was for the deconsecrated parish of St. Jude, an abandoned wooden church built in the late 1800s. The starting bid? $1. Bradford County was desperate to offload the liability. The roof was caving in, the foundation was allegedly sinking, and the county had slated it for demolition by the end of the year if no buyer came forward. For Asher, it wasn't just a building, it was a distraction. It was a project that couldn't argue with him, couldn't take him to court, and couldn't leave him. He paid the dollar online, plus $50 in processing fees, and essentially bought himself a massive, rotting headache. When Asher finally drove his battered Ford F-150 up the winding dirt road to the property, 3 weeks later, the reality of his purchase set in. St. Jude's was a towering, Gothic revival nightmare. The wooden siding was entirely stripped of paint, weathered to a skeletal, silvery grey. The stained glass windows were either shattered or boarded up with rotting plywood. Surrounding the church was a wild overgrowth of Japanese knotweed and ancient dying oak trees that cast long, claw-like shadows across the property. Asher met with Margaret Collins, a skeptical county clerk who had driven out to hand over the heavy iron keys. "You're the dollar man, huh?" Margaret asked, eyeing Asher's city-bought boots, which were already sinking into the mud. "I hope you have 1,000,000 more of those dollars in your pocket." The demolition crews were drawing straws on who had to knock this eyesore down. Locals don't like this place. "Structural issues?" Asher asked, squinting up at the sagging bell tower. "Historical issues," Margaret corrected, pulling her coat tighter against the biting autumn wind. "This land sits right on the edge of what used to be French Asylum. Back in 1793, a bunch of French aristocrats fleeing the Reign of Terror came here. They bought up huge tracts of land to build a refuge for Marie Antoinette. The Queen lost her head before she could make it, but the French stayed for a decade before abandoning the settlement. St. Jude's was built about 80 years later, but folks around here swear the ground was cursed by the aristocrats who starved in the winters." Asher dismissed it as local folklore. As an architect, he only believed in load-bearing walls and foundational integrity. But when Margaret drove away, and he unlocked the heavy oak doors of the church, an icy chill rushed out to greet him, carrying the scent of dry rot, old incense, and something undeniably metallic. The interior was a cathedral of dust. Pews were overturned, the floorboards were warped, and the ceiling showed massive water damage. But Asher's professional eyes were immediately drawn to the front of the room. There, bathed in a solitary shaft of sunlight piercing through a broken skylight, sat the altar. It made absolutely no sense. In a church built of cheap, local pine and fieldstone, the altar was a monolithic block of flawless Carrara marble. It was easily 10 feet long, intricately carved with reliefs of weeping angels, and looked like it belonged in a European basilica, not a forgotten Pennsylvania backwater. More bizarrely, it wasn't centered. It was pushed slightly to the left, as if hastily dropped there. Asher approached it, brushing away a thick layer of grime. He knelt, tapping his knuckles against the wood floor, surrounding the massive stone. Thud, thud, hollow. The acoustics of the floorboards beneath the altar were entirely different from the rest of the nave. Asher assumed the weight of the marble was simply stressing the joists underneath. He spent the next 3 weeks camping in the vestry, surviving on canned soup and instant coffee, drafting a meticulous restoration plan. He intended to stabilize the roof, restore the pine exterior, and perhaps sell the bizarre marble altar to an antique dealer to fund the rest of the project. To help with the heavy lifting, Asher hired Dean Mitchell, a burly 20-something local contractor who owned a portable hydraulic jack. Dean was a pragmatic man, but even he seemed uneasy working inside the drafty, groaning structure. "I asked my granddad about this place," Dean muttered one afternoon, setting up a series of halogen work lights. He said St. Jude's never really had a big congregation. Said the priest who built it, a guy named Father Laurent, bought the land for pennies and built the church right over the ruins of an old French blockhouse. Nobody liked Laurent. Said he spent more time digging in the basement than he did writing sermons. "Well, if he dug a basement, we need to find it," Asher replied. "The floor is sagging heavily near the altar. If there's a void down there, this whole marble piece is going to crash through into the earth." They decided to move the altar. It was a decision that would not only alter the course of Asher's life, but force the Smithsonian and the United States government into a frantic cover-up. Moving a 3-ton block of marble with rudimentary tools is a delicate, dangerous dance. On a Tuesday evening in late October, an unseasonably vicious storm rolled into Bradford County. Torrential rain lashed against the fragile wooden walls of St. Jude's, and thunder shook the very foundation. The roof, which Asher had yet to fully patch, began to leak violently directly over the altar, threatening to rot the already compromised floorboards beneath it. "We have to move it now, or it's going through the floor tonight," Asher yelled over the roar of the rain, pointing his flashlight at a rapidly expanding puddle pooling around the marble base. Dean cursed, wiping rain and sweat from his forehead. He dragged his hydraulic toe jack across the warped floor, wedging the steel lip under the narrowest side of the altar. "I'll pump it up," Dean shouted. "You get the steel rollers under the base." Asher nodded, dropping to his knees with heavy steel pipes. As Dean cranked the jack, the hydraulic hiss was deafening. The massive marble altar groaned, resisting the lift. Slowly, agonizingly, it rose an inch, then 2. Asher shoved the first steel pipe under the stone. "Okay, let it down on the roller," Asher yelled. But as the weight of the marble transferred from the jack to the steel roller, the structural integrity of the ancient pine floor finally gave out. With a deafening crack that sounded like a cannon shot, the floorboards beneath the altar splintered. The massive stone lurched backward, sliding off the roller and crashing through the floor. Asher dove backward, scraping his arms against the pews, narrowly avoiding having his legs crushed. A cloud of toxic, centuries-old dust plumed into the air. Dean grabbed Asher by the collar, hauling him away from the collapse. When the dust finally settled, illuminated by the harsh white glare of the fallen halogen work lights, they crept back to the edge of the jagged hole. The altar hadn't fallen far. It had dropped only about 3 feet before coming to rest on something incredibly solid. Asher shone his flashlight into the void. The altar was resting on a foundation of expertly laid, mortarless stone. A structural impossibility for a cheap 1800s wooden church. But that wasn't what made Asher's breath catch in his throat. Where the altar had previously sat, The collapsing floor had peeled back to reveal a massive wrought-iron trapdoor set flush into the stone foundation. "What the hell is that?" Dean whispered, his voice trembling. Asher didn't answer. He lowered himself into the shallow void, his boots touching the ancient stone. He approached the trapdoor. It was entirely black, heavily oxidized, and secured with an enormous, rusted padlock. But right in the center of the iron hatch was a raised crest. Asher brushed the dirt away. It was a shield, flanked by intricate scrollwork, bearing 3 distinct lilies. "A fleur-de-lis," Asher murmured. He remembered Margaret's words about the French aristocrats. "Asher, man, we should call the police, or the county. This is out of our pay grade," Dean said, pacing nervously above the hole. "It's my property," Asher replied, a strange electric obsession taking hold of him. The despair and apathy that had plagued him since his divorce vanished in an instant. He wasn't bankrupt Asher Caldwell anymore. He was a man standing on the precipice of a profound mystery. "Toss me the bolt cutters from your truck." Dean hesitated, the thunder masking his heavy sigh, before jogging out into the rain. He returned minutes later, handing down a pair of massive yellow-handled heavy-duty cutters. Asher clamped the steel jaws around the neck of the ancient padlock. It took all of his body weight, his muscles burning as he forced the handles together. The rusted iron resisted, shrieking in protest, before finally snapping with a sharp ping. Asher tossed the broken lock aside. He grabbed the heavy iron ring welded to the trapdoor. "Help me pull." Dean dropped down beside him. Together, they heaved. The hinges, dormant for perhaps 2 centuries, screamed with a bone-chilling grind. The trapdoor yielded, falling back with a heavy thud against the stone. A rush of air expelled from the darkness below. It wasn't the damp, earthy smell of a root cellar. It smelled of sulfur, dried leather, and an intense metallic staleness. Asher aimed his flashlight down. A narrow, spiraling staircase, carved directly into the bedrock, descended into the earth. It was a staggering feat of engineering, far predating the wooden church above it. "I'm going down," Asher said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're insane," Dean said, though he didn't stop him. He unclipped a secondary flashlight from his belt, and together they began the slow descent. The air grew significantly colder with each step. Condensation glistened on the limestone walls. After winding down for roughly 30 feet, the stairs ended at an arched entryway, sealed by a rotting wooden door. The wood was so decayed it crumbled like damp cardboard when Asher kicked it. They stepped into a vast, subterranean chamber. Asher swept his flashlight across the room, and his blood ran cold. The chamber was lined with massive oak beams, reinforcing the ceiling. But it was the contents of the room that defied all logic. Stacked against the far wall were dozens of heavy wooden crates, bound in iron straps. They bore the same fleur-de-lis seal, stamped in faded black ink, and sitting on a wooden chair in the center of the room, facing the door, was a human skeleton. Dean let out a sharp cry and scrambled backward, tripping over the bottom stair. "Nope. No, I'm out, Asher. I'm calling the cops." "Wait," Asher snapped, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He forced himself to step closer to the remains. The skeleton was dressed in the tatters of a military uniform. Scraps of dark blue wool and tarnished gold braiding clung to the bone. A rusted flintlock pistol lay on the stone floor beneath the figure's dangling right hand. It wasn't a modern victim. This person had died centuries ago. Asher leaned in, his flashlight trembling. Hanging around the skeleton's cervical vertebrae was a heavy, tarnished silver chain holding a thick signet ring. Asher used his pen to carefully lift the ring to the light without touching the remains. The crest on the ring matched the trapdoor, but below it were engraved words that made Asher's architectural mind spin. Garde du Trésor Royal, guard of the royal treasury. Asher slowly turned his light from the skeleton to the dozens of iron-bound crates lining the walls. If the legend of French Asylum was true, this wasn't just a hideout. This was the legendary lost shipment, the personal treasury of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, smuggled out of France in 1793 to fund their new empire in America, a fortune that historians unanimously agreed had been lost at sea. Asher Caldwell hadn't just bought a church for $1. He had just purchased the lost wealth of the French monarchy. Asher stood completely paralyzed, the beam of his flashlight bouncing off the heavy iron bands of the crates. The silence in the subterranean chamber was deafening, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of Dean Mitchell near the stairwell. "Asher!" Dean hissed, his voice echoing off the damp limestone walls. "We are leaving, right now. That is a dead body. This is a crime scene." "This isn't a crime scene, Dean. It's a tomb," Asher replied, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped carefully around the skeletal remains of the royal guard, moving toward the nearest crate. He slipped a flathead pry bar from his tool belt. The iron straps of the crate were heavily oxidized, flaking away like rusted pastry crust. Asher wedged the steel tip beneath the lid and leaned his weight into it. The centuries-old wood groaned in protest before yielding with a sharp, echoing snap. Asher lifted the lid and aimed his flashlight inside. Dean, unable to resist the pull of human curiosity, crept up behind him and peered over Asher's shoulder. Both men stopped breathing. The crate wasn't filled with historical documents or old weapons. It was packed to the brim with velvet bags that had mostly disintegrated into dark powder. Beneath the rotted fabric lay a sea of gold. Thousands of Louis d'Or coins gleamed under the harsh white light, their surfaces perfectly preserved, bearing the stoic profile of King Louis XVI. Asher plunged his gloved hand into the coins. They were unimaginably heavy. He pulled out a handful, letting the gold cascade back into the crate with a rich metallic clatter that sounded like music. "Do you know what this is?" Asher asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 1793, Marie Antoinette's loyalists bought a massive tract of land up here in Pennsylvania. It was called French Asylum. The plan was to break the king and queen out of Paris and bring them here, but the royals were executed before the plan could hatch. Historians always wondered what happened to the vast fortune smuggled out of Paris to fund the settlement. It was rumored to have been lost at sea, and it's been sitting under a $1 church, Dean murmured, his eyes wide, reflecting the golden light. "Asher, there are at least 30 crates in here. This isn't millions. This is... I don't even know. It's priceless. It's sovereign wealth," Asher said, the reality crashing down on him. He knew immediately that they were out of their depth. Finding a bag of cash was a lucky break. Finding the lost treasury of the Bourbon dynasty was an international geopolitical nightmare. If the county found out, they would seize the land. If the state found out, they would claim eminent domain. If the French government found out, they would demand repatriation. Asher needed an expert, someone he could trust implicitly. He pulled out his phone, holding it up toward the ceiling of the crypt until he found a single bar of cellular service. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Hello?" A groggy voice answered. "William, it's Asher Caldwell." Dr. William Hastings was a prominent professor of European history at Georgetown University, and more importantly, Asher's former college roommate. "Asher?" Do you know it's 2 in the morning? William, I need you to get in your car and drive to Bradford County, Pennsylvania, right now. Have you lost your mind? I have a lecture at 9. Cancel it, Asher insisted. I found French asylum, not the settlement, the treasury. I have a royal guard sitting in front of me with a Garde du Trésor Royal signet ring, guarding 30 crates of louis d'or. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. Asher, if this is a joke, I bought an abandoned church. The altar was hiding a crypt. I need a historian who knows how to handle sovereign artifacts before the government sweeps in and steals it. Please, William. Don't touch anything else, William said, his voice suddenly sharp and awake. I'm on my way. For the next 4 hours, Asher and Dean sat in the church above the trapdoor, shivering in the cold dampness, guarding the hole like watchdogs. When William's Volvo finally crunched up the gravel driveway just after sunrise, the storm had broken, leaving a thick, eerie fog rolling off the Susquehanna River. William, a tall, pragmatic man with graying temples, rushed into the church carrying an aluminum briefcase. When Asher led him down the spiral staircase into the crypt, the historian dropped to his knees. My God, William breathed, shining a specialized UV light over the crates and the skeleton. He examined the signet ring without touching the bones. This is Captain Laurent de Visme. He was the master of the King's transport. The historical record says he died of yellow fever in Philadelphia. It was a cover story. William stood up, his face pale. Asher, this is the most significant historical discovery on American soil in a century, but you are in terrible danger. The louis d'or coins are just the currency. If the rest of these crates hold what I think they hold, the crown jewels of the Bourbon monarchs, the royal ciphers, the Queen's missing diamonds, every government agency and private claimant in the world is going to want this. The legal battle alone will outlive you. I own the land, Asher argued defensively. You own the dirt, William corrected gently. You don't own the heritage of a foreign nation. We need to call the FBI art crime team immediately. If we go to them first, we control the narrative. We can negotiate a finder's fee. If we try to hide it... Before William could finish his sentence, the heavy wooden doors of the church upstairs slammed open with a violent crash. Asher, Dean, and William froze. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed on the warped pine floorboards above. It wasn't the police. Police announced themselves. Asher crept silently up the spiral staircase, peering over the edge of the jagged hole in the floor. 3 men in dark, tactical windbreakers were fanning out across the nave. They moved with military precision. In the center of the church stood a 4th man, dressed incongruously in an expensive, bespoke charcoal suit. He was looking directly at the hole in the floor. "Mr. Caldwell," the man in the suit called out, his voice smooth and echoing with a slight European accent. "Please come up. It would be a shame to have an accident in such a historic place." Asher's blood ran cold. He gripped the heavy steel pry bar in his right hand and slowly climbed out of the hole, stepping into the dusty light of the church. Dean and William followed closely behind, their faces pale with shock. "Who are you?" Asher demanded, stepping in front of his friends. "My name is Richard Croft," the man said, offering a polite but chilling smile. "I represent a private consortium based in Geneva, descendants of the surviving French aristocracy. They have been quietly monitoring property deeds in Bradford County for 40 years, waiting for the St. Jude parcel to change hands. When a desperate architect bought it for $1, our algorithms flagged the transaction. We knew you'd eventually look under the altar." "You're trespassing," Dean barked, though his voice trembled. "And you are standing on stolen property," Croft replied smoothly. He gestured to his armed men. The contents of that crypt do not belong to you, Mr. Caldwell. They do not belong to the United States. They belong to the bloodlines from which they were stolen. Now, I am authorized to offer you a sum of $2 million for your silence and cooperation. You will walk to your truck, drive away, and we will extract the crates. Everyone goes home rich. $2 million? William scoffed from behind Asher. There is easily $2 billion worth of sovereign wealth down there. And you can't just move it. It requires archaeological preservation. We have our own experts, Croft said coldly. His smile vanished. Mr. Caldwell, the $2 million was a courtesy. My men can just as easily secure the site, and you three can take Captain de Wiesem's place in the dark. The choice is yours. Step away from the hole. The men in windbreakers rested their hands deliberately on the holstered firearms at their hips. Asher looked at the men, then down at the hole, and finally up at the rotting ceiling of the church. The panicked architect who had bought this building a month ago was dead. In his place stood a man who understood the fundamental laws of stress, weight, and leverage. "Dean," Asher said softly, never breaking eye contact with Croft. "The hydraulic jack." Dean blinked, confused for a second, before his eyes darted to the heavy steel toe jack still sitting near the edge of the pit. "Grab it," Asher ordered. Dean lunged, grabbing the heavy jack. One of Croft's men drew his weapon, but Asher raised his hand sharply. "Shoot us, and you bury the gold forever," Asher yelled, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Croft raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. "What are you doing?" Asher stepped back to the edge of the hole. "This church is a Gothic revival structure, Mr. Croft, built cheaply, with a massive top-heavy bell tower. For 150 years, the only thing keeping this rotting building from collapsing into the earth is the structural integrity of the floor. But right now, the floor is gone." Asher pointed into the crypt. "The primary load-bearing oak beam of the entire church is directly beneath us, exposed when the floor caved in. It's holding up the bell tower, the roof, and the 3-ton Carrara marble altar that is currently teetering on the edge of this pit." Asher grabbed the hydraulic jack from Dean and wedged it violently against the ancient, splintering oak beam bridging the crypt. He grabbed the steel pumping handle. "I am a structural architect," Asher said, his eyes burning with defiance. "I know exactly how much pressure it takes to snap a compromised beam. You take one step closer, and I pump this handle. The beam snaps, the altar falls, the bell tower caves in. 200 tons of fieldstone, iron, and rotting timber will instantly collapse into that crypt. It will vaporize the crates, crush the gold into the bedrock, and kill all of us. No one gets it." Croft's arrogant posture dissolved. He looked up at the groaning, water-damaged ceiling, then down at the massive marble block teetering precariously over the void. He knew Asher wasn't bluffing. "You're insane," Croft hissed. "I've got nothing to lose," Asher roared back. "Dean, check your phone." Dean, catching on, pulled out his phone. "Message sent. My cousin is a state trooper in Towanda. They're 5 minutes out." Croft's jaw tightened. He weighed the options. A prolonged shootout, a collapsed building, and incoming police. The quiet extraction was ruined. "This isn't over, Caldwell," Croft spat. He turned to his men. "Fall back. Now!" The men swiftly retreated out the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the morning fog. Moments later, the roar of SUV engines echoed down the valley. Asher didn't let go of the jack handle until the distant wail of police sirens pierced the quiet air. He collapsed onto the dusty floor, his hands shaking violently. The aftermath was a bureaucratic hurricane. By noon, the Pennsylvania State Police had locked down the county. By nightfall, black helicopters bearing the insignia of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security descended on the property. William Hastings's connections proved invaluable. He managed to contact the director of the Smithsonian Institution before the FBI could completely black out the site. For a week, Asher, Dean, and William were held in a secure hotel in Harrisburg, undergoing intense debriefings. The U.S. government realized the sheer diplomatic catastrophe they had on their hands. If the existence of the Bourbon treasury was made public, the litigation with France and private syndicates like Crofts would cause an international incident. They needed it to disappear. Under the authority of the National Security Act, the United States government quietly claimed eminent domain over the St. Jude property. The official public record stated that the church was demolished due to a toxic sinkhole discovered beneath the foundation, rendering the land uninhabitable. In a windowless room in Washington, D.C., Asher sat across from a high-ranking official from the Treasury Department. "You sign these non-disclosure agreements, Mr. Caldwell," the official said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. "You forget the gold. You forget the French. You tell people you sold the land to the state for a modest profit. In exchange, the United States government is awarding you a classified, tax-free finder's fee for the preservation of historical antiquities." Asher looked at the check slid across the table. It was for $25 million. Dean and William were each receiving $5 million. Asher signed the papers. He took a sip of his coffee, feeling the warm sun on his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He hadn't given the FBI everything. In the chaotic moments before Croft had burst into the church, Asher had found something loose in the dust near the captain's skeleton. He tipped the pouch into his palm. A perfectly cut, flawless blue sapphire caught the California sunlight, throwing brilliant azure fractals across the wooden table. It was rumored Marie Antoinette had lost a favorite ring before her imprisonment. Now, Asher Caldwell was its quiet guardian. He had bought a church for $1, and it had bought him the world. Wow, what a story. From a bankrupt architect risking his last dollar to a high-stakes standoff over centuries-old royal treasure, Asher's discovery proves that history is sometimes buried right beneath our feet. Would you have taken the government's millions or tried to fight for the whole fortune? Let me know what you would do in the comments below. If you enjoyed this incredible, true-life mystery, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more hidden history.